accusations of being sheeple, accusing others of blindly following a political leader or a political party, accusations of a lack of critical thinking. These are all things that we see a lot during the heavy political seasons, and it's understandable. The thing that I find interesting with this, though, is that as I've followed people that make these accusations over time, most often the people that are making these accusations the quickest or the most vehemently are people who are engaging in behavior that falls in line with this themselves. In reality, it's simple projection. People accuse others of what they themselves are doing. But what's being said often when people make these accusations is that it is, you're not considering my perspective, or you don't understand my perspective, or you haven't heard what I've heard. Sometimes that's the case, often it's not. When it's not, it may be that the other person disagrees and they're just not convinced by the other person's perspective or point of view. But all of these are really looking at its foundation, are accusations of a lack of critical thinking. Well, I've taught about critical thinking for quite a few years. So let's look at this, particularly as applied to the political process for a minute. What does critical thinking entail? Well, first of all, it entails being aware of your own bias. And a lot of times people that are making these accusations of sheeple or other people blindly following others, they're not aware of some of their own biases that are where they're doing some of the similar things. A second aspect of critical thinking is trying to bracket off our biases, at least temporarily. It doesn't have to be long-term, or at the very least being aware of our bias and how that may impact how we interpret things. Because we're always interpreting. That's a constant here. Two other components of critical thinking, as we apply to this political process, is trying to cognitively understand other perspectives and trying to empathetically understand other perspectives. Now, the cognitive is more that thinking understanding. I can understand what they're saying, and maybe even a little bit of why they're saying it as far from an intellectual perspective. But that empathetic trying to understand emotionally, try to understand emotionally why someone might follow one political candidate or another, one party or another, and not doing this in a way that's looking for fault. And that's another key component of critical thinking. It's not listening to the other perspective to identify what's wrong with it. If you're listening to other perspectives just to tear it down or undermine it or point out what's wrong or limited with it, you're not engaging in critical thinking. You're engaging in a very biased process of trying to attack a perspective that's different than yours. And most likely, you're engaging in some of the dynamics that could more rightly be understood as blindly following a political party or a political perspective or a political candidate. So herein lies some of the problem. That when we are listening to find fault, we're not critical thinking and we're not really listening. We see this similarly often with couples who are fighting, organizations who are fighting. They're not really listening to the other. They're just listening to find fault. Now, part of what's really empowering this process is that in recent times, what we're seeing, particularly in the United States, though, and I can speak to it more in the United States, but it's happening in some other countries certainly as well, is that we tend to be getting a lot of our information from very biased perspectives, and we tend to view the views that align with us as being less biased, and whatever disagree with us as being more biased. So let's look at two of the primary examples of this in the United States. MSNBC and Fox News. Now, if you look at both of these, they don't fare very well in the fact-checking. And they're both rated as very biased. Now, one of them does poor in the fact-checking. Both of them show up pretty strongly in the bias. But either way, these are, the majority of what you see on these, and particularly what's being quoted from these, is not news per se. It's political commentary. It's looking at what's happening in the news through a biased political perspective. And we need to be cautious of what's coming from these. Now, if you agree with everything that Fox News says, or almost everything that Fox News says, and don't agree with anything that MSNBC says, or vice versa, you agree with almost everything that MSNBC says and nothing that Fox News says, you're probably not engaging in great critical thinking there. And it's not so much the disagreeing with the other perspective that's the problem, but that you always agree with one. Because what we know pretty definitively is that both of these are very biased sources and don't always fare great with the fact checking. So what we want to do is step back a little bit from political commentary and look at news more objectively, being aware of our bias if we're really going to be engaging in critical thinking. When we're engaging in looking at it just through this political lens, we're not going to be as accurate, and we're also going to easily be pulled in. That what MSNBC and Fox News do, as well as a lot of other places, is they draw upon your emotions. And sometimes with the headlines. It's amazing how often we see people just quoting the headlines as fact. But the headlines are trying to get you to read. Very often, if you look at these and then you go and look at what actually happened, it's pretty obvious that it is not accurate. This happens on both sides. Both Fox News and MSNBC do the same thing, where they take something, they remove it from context, and they become highly critical of it. The political process is incredibly complex. If you don't understand the complexity of it, you don't really understand it. And if you're not willing to try and understand the complexity of it, then my recommendation is be cautious in what you put out there, because you're going to often, look more the part of the fool yourself because you're not recognizing that complexity of it. Just like when, one of the things that we see often is these headlines of so-and-so voted against something that's very popular. Well, when you go in and look what happened, it doesn't mean that they were against that issue. It's that bills often have a lot of other things attached to them. And so they may be supported this one aspect, but they didn't support other aspects. So we can make pretty much any politician look very bad just by taking bills out of context and not looking at them. So if you want to claim that you're engaging in critical thinking, one of the first things that you need to do is, when you hear these different stories, and these sensationalized stories in particular, that you do some fact checking. You go and try and look at the original. So if one candidate said something, go and listen to it. And not just the snippet of it, but try and listen to the context, what led up to what they said and what was after what they said. So go to the original source, go to the fact checks, and try to really understand and try and keep an open mind. If you are finding that you disagree with every fact check of your candidate, well, you're probably falling into that category of blind faith in a particular leader or party, and into what could more rightly be called being a sheeple. But personally, I don't like that label of sheeple, because it's really just used as an attack, and it's normally done without much thought. It's almost always a simple projection with someone engaging in the exact same behaviors they're accusing other of. So let's try and deepen our thought around political issues in the political seasons going forward. Instead of just blindly following or blindly accusing, let's try and really look at the issues, try to really understand them. And if you can do that, then you can rightly claim that you're being a good critical thinker, and that, and my guess is, it's going to be much more difficult to just agree with anything one or the other party says or one or other candidate says, because what you're going to recognize clearly is that both candidates have their flaws, both candidates sometimes misrepresent things, both candidates make mistakes. And now, this is not saying that all of those are equal, certainly not. There are more atrocious lies, more atrocious deceptions, more intentional deceptions, greater deceptions, and greater patterns of deceptions that occur. And I think one of the really sad things is that frequently what we're seeing now is even the fact checkers are really getting attacked. Well, we should hold the fact checkers accountable. But often when a fact checker is really doing a good neutral job, they might get attacked some from both sides, from the right and from the left, from both candidates. And while it's good that we don't blindly trust the fact checkers either. If we just blindly dismiss them as being biased all the time, there's a problem. Now, there are exceptions to this because there are fact checkers that are really and rather intentionally biased, such as ones you might see on MSNBC and Fox News. But if you look at some of the more nonpartisan ones, such as PolitiFact and I'm going to forget some of the others right now, but if you look at some of those and you're always disagreeing with them, then again, you might be getting caught up in the blind faith in one perspective and not really looking at both sides. So let's bring some depth of thought to the political process.